Hello, my name is Leanna Renee Hieber, and I am the author of 13 Gothic gas lamp fantasy novels. So by that, we mean that they are novels set in the late Victorian era, set in New York and in London, with lots of ghosts and spooky goings on. And I'm also a ghost tour guide in Manhattan. And so ghosts and spooky things are kind of my trade and training. My latest series is The Spectral City, set in New York in 1899, and I'm going to read from the very beginning of this novel. 1899 Manhattan. Manhattan dinner parties in the gilded 1890s had become a studied spectacle and opulence for the ruling class of the country's wealthiest city. The bustling, ever-striving, never-sleeping metropolis's class of most fashionable, up-to-date, technologically accessorized, bejeweled, and beholden to no one but themselves were the kinds of company that the Prenz family kept. Curating people and their statuses like one might think of assembling a stock portfolio. That's how it appeared to Margaret Haythorne as she floated into the parlor for light aperitifs and a bit of music and chatter before dinner. She knew the types, their predilections and their concerns. Margaret had been born into wealth, and during her young life she'd been quite enamored of high society's trappings, dalliances, and luxuries, their petty dramas, and the consequential ways their decisions affected the city. From her vantage point, she could see the full scope. She had seen and learned much since those days of carefree and impetuous youth. Not only had she come to understand the tired adage of money not buying happiness, but she realized that Poe had been on to something with the Masque of the Red Death. There were dangers in being too shielded, too gilded, too able to make up one's own rules for life, too easily sheltered away from the horrors and cares of the world. She could feel a sense of dread here, as if the Red Death were lurking in the hallway just beyond. Maybe it was, clad in some beautiful House of Worth gown, or some finely tailored frock coat with satin lapels. It should be noted that Margaret Haythorne herself was dead. Her perspective was one of two worlds, and for nearly 2 decades she had floated between the living and the dead. Once, on the heels of her untimely and harrowing murder, she had nearly decided to seek out the light and go on to that great, sweet summer land that the legitimate spiritualists spoke of. Heaven, peace, almost. The corridor of light had opened before her, and she had almost sought out forgiveness in the oblivion of some great and unknowable thing. But the spectral city kept drawing her back. New York was a body she felt destined to orbit, an otherworldly magnet. There was so much to do. There was so much to learn. There was so much to fix, to reveal, to fight for, now that she now knew had deep meaning that had been lost to her in a life looking into gilded frames and too many mirrors in which she'd primped lustrous curls. Looking into the mirror here, gazing into the center of its wide gold frame and etched glass detailing, as she floated in this gaudy and ostentatious mansion she'd been drawn into, she saw a wisp of herself. Nearly entirely transparent, there was just a slight contouring of the air where her figure floated. She was nothing but a slight shade of glowing lines, features frozen in youth. She had agreed to stay a consistent New York City haunt because of the living. Her ongoing work with family and friends gave her purpose, and a mission she'd never had as an admittedly vapid socialite whose ill-advised curiosity had killed her like the most inelegant of cats. But to say she had full command over her immortal coil would be a lie. Take this evening, for example. She'd been drawn in to a stranger's mansion and found herself floating about a fine parlor, bedecked in marble, velvet, and seemingly unending gold trim, with no idea why. Spiritualists, as the uniquely American version of the sect had been born of Quakers, would often utter that they spoke as the spirits moved. Sometimes the spirits, too, were moved by unseen forces and unfathomable hands. She had been moved here for reasons she hoped would reveal themselves. Surveying the room, floating along behind the present company at a sufficient distance so as not to strike up complaints of drafts or chills, offered Maggie the clues of family name and fortune. A few framed images on the parlor walls featured images of Beautiful women in frothy day dresses holding decorative bottles trimmed with golden filigree, boasting the great and calming healing powers of Pren's tonics. This is where she was, the Pren's mansion. This family had been on her mind. Something wasn't right about this place, about this family, and the spirit world knew it. Maggie had followed a series of incidences and instincts to this mansion, all in a rush. There were secrets to be exposed. She now floated by a mantelpiece littered with objects d'art from around the world and watched the festivities unfold. There was a medium present, or at least she was costumed as such, with an embroidered set of robes, a turban, and too much eye makeup. The most theatrical ones, who appropriated religious aspects of other cultures and muddied the meaning right out of them with fetishistic Orientalism, tended to be the most fraudulent ones. So Maggie was certain it wasn't the medium who had summoned her directly into this space. No, fellow ghosts had drawn her in. 2 of them, children, dressed in traditional garb of a skirt and vest, the other in shorts with shoulder straps straight out of a Bavarian folk tale. Fellow ghosts appeared to Maggie's eyes as fully grayscale figures, their features more solid and clear than any reflection she could see in mirrors. The grim storybook children pointed to the mantel towards a specific object. There, between a set of candelabras, sat a simple box with a latch. An etching in the wood proclaimed it to be something of smoking supplies. "Open it," the little girl of the 2 begged. "You're a potent spirit," said the other, likely her brother, adding hopefully. "We've been weakened here and nothing responds to our touch. Open it, show everyone, throw it. This family can't keep hurting all of us." Maggie knew from working with ghost colleagues and mediums on a spate of recent mysteries that living subjects, under possible investigation, react in vastly different ways to poltergeist activity. She had no idea what she was about to set in motion, but she also didn't have anything to lose. Dear Eve, the young lady to whom Maggie had pledged the work and gifts of her spirit, would be cross with her for acting on a hunch without informing her. There are protocols, paperwork. One can't just barge in and begin levitating family belongings. She would chide, as if she were a bemused mother and not a 19-year-old taskmaster, brisk old soul in a youthful body. But every time Maggie had an instinct about this mansion and the people in it, results eluded her. It's why she'd never brought the Pren's name to Eve's attention. She wasn't going to send Eve's new ghost precinct on a wild goose chase when she was trying to prove herself. Here was the opportunity to engage with an actual object that might be hard evidence and not conjecture. No detective could work with conjecture. She'd learned it was their least favorite word and a liability they couldn't afford. It was clear that none of the living people in the room saw the 3 spirits. As there were no indications, no shudders, no looking around as if suddenly unsettled, no brushing down the hackle of small hairs up the backs of their bejeweled, satin-swathed necks, a poltergeist would prove the most surprising, unsettling, and least expected event of the night. The fact that the medium didn't look around or sense any presences when Maggie or the other children appeared revealed the woman as a fraud. The trick would be mustering the energy, the momentum to move an object. She'd long since forgotten what being corporeal felt like, and that had always been the easiest way, to simply interact with an object just like you would have done in life, feeling a phantom limb in reverse. Overthinking it was also a curse, so she just allowed herself to rifle through a memory box of every time she'd been humiliated or patronized at an event like this during her entire corporeal life. Just because she'd been in high society didn't mean it had ever been kind to her. It treated young, eligible women as pretty cattle, sold to the highest bidder in the marketplace of social climbing. This surge of frustration was enough. She swatted a weightless hand at the metal box. It went flying and landed in the corner of a floral Persian rug, opening and spilling its contents, a stack of photographic images. Cries went up everywhere. All 8 adults in the room reacted with a jump or a vocal start at the crash of the box. Bodies leaned in, but no one approached the box or its contents. They simply stared. The photographs were recent, by their finish and lack of yellowing around the edges. Maggie took a moment to stare at the pictures she revealed to the company. Something bothered her about their nature. They were all posed with props and scenery, costumes and crowns or halos. There was something too stilted about the figures, something eerie about their features. Post-mortem photography. When it was so common, one learned to tell the difference between images of the living and the photographs of the dead. Often a photograph of a dead loved one was the only picture a family had of them. But these were more elaborately staged than Maggie had ever seen, far more than was any sort of custom. Maggie stared at the ghosts of the two young children, who had fierce, defiant looks on their faces as they took in the horrified expressions of the living. She saw a photograph lying there of the two of them in their Bavarian garb, posed with a shepherd's crook and a prop sheep. Their eyes were closed, but their eyelids had been painted with eyes as if they were open. A tall, thin, dour-looking man in a fine umber-brown suit coat strode forward, his long face elongated in a frown, his auburn hair graying at the temples. This man scooped up the strewn images with an irritated sigh, glaring in the direction of Maggie, but not directly at her. This man, she determined, must be the Pren's patriarch. "What were those?" a young woman sitting on a velvet settee asked, leaning forward curiously. Everyone stared at their host, who offered a thin-lipped smile. "Confiscated property from a recent wayward friend. I have been known to minister to those among my station who are lost. This is a friend's collection. What an unfortunate fetish to covet deceased who are not his kin. I took them away lest he be haunted. Perhaps I have brought a haunt upon us instead. What an ungodly thing. Isn't that right, Madam Nightstar?" Maggie nearly snorted at the unoriginal stage name. The man turned to the medium, who was white as a sheet. "Oh, of course, Mr. Prenz, of course." Maggie wanted to interject that there was nothing inherently ungodly about a spirit in the least, but the man ushered everyone out of the room to go on to dinner, saying he would be right in with them. They did so, looking warily at the upturned box, at their host, and at the medium before obeying and filing out to a feast. Once the parlor door had closed behind the last guest, the towering man closed the distance between himself and Maggie in 2 easy strides. "Naughty girl," the man clucked, staring at Maggie directly, eye to eye. That answered the question whether or not she could be seen by him. He hadn't given her any clue before. "How did you get in?" Maggie turned toward the children. They were gone. "Just passing by," Maggie replied, unsure if he could hear her. "Well, now that you're here, stay indefinitely," the man said with a leering grin. He moved to the door, to a switch along the wall that surely controlled the lighting. She had assumed from the opulence of the home that the lighting was electric. It was too bright, had a harsher quality, and the man made it only more so as he turned a knob and the lights grew even brighter, impossibly so. The room grew blinding. Maggie squinted, raising an incorporeal arm over her eyes as if she could shield herself. Along with the bright light came a hum, a rising, whining, whirring, grating noise like a mechanical roar. The sound hurt. The light burned. She felt as though she were being torn apart. She opened her mouth to scream, and then utter darkness. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to put it in gallery view so I can see each other. That was great. It's such a privilege to hear you read it. It really leaps off the page. So thank you very much.
My years of theater training come in handy when I'm doing when I'm reading. So thank you.
A proper dramatic reading. That was great. I loved it. Well, so thank you very much for coming and joining us and sharing with us your first in the series of Spectral City. If I'm not wrong, you have another book in that series out at the moment. Which number is it at this point?
Yes, so the Spectral City trilogy is a trilogy, and it is complete as of tomorrow. We're recording this on the 20th. Tomorrow is the 21st, and so A Summoning of Souls is the third and final book in this trilogy. I will likely do other things with these characters in other capacities going forward. I love these characters too much, particularly Maggie here, who's in the prologue, and she's one of the main characters of the book. And the search for what happens to her is one of the inciting incidents of this particular book. And the Prenz family, this nasty patriarch, really goes through the entire series, and there's a culmination in the book that's going to release tomorrow. So it really does come full circle from this prologue to the finale, where the big bad is revealed. For those who are mystery fans, it's been interesting because the folks who are mystery and not as much fantasy fans are very frustrated sometimes that not all of the mystery is solved in book one. It is sort of a 3-tier mystery in a 3-part fantasy series. So I am a fantasist as much as anything else. There are 3 separate mysteries, and one will be revealed in each of the 3 books. So starts with Spectral City, then a Sanctuary of Spirits, and then as of tomorrow, a Summoning of Souls.
I mean, I have to say that after having met the patriarch of the Prenz family, I was hoping that he would get his comeuppance sooner.
Yes, sorry that you have to wait till the 3rd book for the comeuppance, but it's an epic one, I promise.
So this obviously isn't your first series. You also have another one, which I believe you've got a version of to show us, that is also quite Gothic, would you say?
It is. I mean, I honestly have Gothic elements in absolutely everything that I do. I personally use the word Gothic in all of my work because there are elements of it. It is my favorite genre. It's basically what I cut my teeth on as a child. I'm wearing Edgar Allan Poe around my neck. I mean, he's really my North Star. And so many themes that are in the 19th century Gothic specifically for me were the reason why I wanted to become a writer. So it's really inextricable from my style. Some of my series have more direct Gothic elements than others, but this Strangely Beautiful series, as we can see, this very dark and stormy night cover is the revised author's preferred edition. This was my debut novel. So this came out in 2009. It's a series of 4 books, and they all deal with basically a group of Ghostbusters in 1888 at the time of Jack the Ripper. And there's some world travel involved as well, but mostly set in London. But there's also part of the series takes place in Cairo in 1867 and then moves through to the finale in World War I. So I'm dealing with epic Greek mythological themes that are playing out on the streets of London. So that one's very much a sort of, if you mixed a Gothic with a high fantasy, sort of if, high fantasy met Jane Eyre, is kind of my thought there, with a healthy dose of Magical Academy in there. And so that's where I started, was in this sort of, epic space of like, there are Greek gods that I have toyed with their mythologies and bleeding out on the streets of London and all the good drama. But I also have been interested in kind of trying to really make my series very character driven. Yes, still big epic plots, but really make it as much about the characters as anything. So I have 4 different series out. After Strangely Beautiful, I wrote the Magic Most Foul trilogy, and then the Eternophiles trilogy, and now the Spectral City series. So they all have crossover characters. So you don't have to have read one series to appreciate the next. The only ones that don't directly cross over are Strangely Beautiful to Spectral City, because the timelines are pretty different on those. But my young adult series, which is my Magic Most Foul series, and my Eternophile series directly cross into Spectral City. So I love epic family drama. So, and by family drama, I mean found family as much as anything. That's a really big theme through all of my books. So there's my big happy family.
I mean, that's something that I've really been enjoying about Spectral City, is the sort of the group of clairvoyants, or the group of mediums who have come together, and they're all from very different situations and different walks of life, and they have this community to come to. So is that sort of something that runs through all of your work? And why is it
definitely so it's so important for me, because I think that within the Gothic, there is such a theme of isolation. And when you are isolated in a Gothic novel, nothing good ever happens. So I'm trying to sort of turn the isolation trope on its head and try to find places where the outcasts and marginalized folks, whether it's women who didn't have the rights at that time that they were fighting for, whether it's my trans woman who doesn't have the modern language to say who she is, but she is who she is, and trans folks and folks of every identity have always existed. It's not a modern, that's not a modern concept. The idea that there can be a place where folks, my biracial Cora can come up from New Orleans and have a place where she can have a place at the table. A little girl who suffers from selective mutism and she can't speak, but she's learning sign language, and she's a gifted psychic, can also have a place at the table. So the idea of trying to create a safe haven by these sort of kind of spooky paranormal gifts, for me, is kind of this fun way to engage with the darkness and the themes about Gothic literature that I love, but I can make it loving in the way that I'm bringing all this all together. And so I really wanted to turn, specifically with Spectral City, my whole idea was I wanted to turn the idea of what's a ghost story on its head. I wanted there to be main characters who are friendly ghosts who are trying to help the situation. And so Eve, my main protagonist, is trying to kind of make ghosts a little more socially acceptable for the world. And sort of, she's, one of her taglines is, I'd like you to think of ghosts as a help, not a horror. So I'm also engaging with what we think is frightening as people, and ask that sort of question, which I do in certain ways through all of my work, but specifically with Spectral City, I was like, how can I tell a ghost story, but in a way that's more like a family drama?
Yes, amazing. I love it. So you, obviously Spectral City is set in New York, and I don't know New York, but I've been there for all of 2 days in my entire life. So I don't have a feel for the city, but I feel like the city very much comes through in the book. So obviously you've said that you're a ghost guide, so you're very familiar with the modern New York. And did you do a lot of research in recreating the New York of that period?
That's a great question. One of the reasons why I actually wanted to become a tour guide was because, you know, we all know writing is not a profession where you can count on writing as your sole income. So you got to have something else, unless you're one of the rare folks who just, you know, hits it big right out of the gate. But I always knew I was going to have something else supplemental to my writing. And being a tour guide was great because I knew I wanted to write books about New York. And so any research that I was doing as a tour guide was going to directly feed into my books. And so that time was time well spent, never a wasted moment in terms of anything I learned about New York. And I specifically sought out what of the 19th century is still extant in Manhattan and in the 5 boroughs, and lots of it is. There's so much, and I tried to really focus on things that are still standing in the series, that you can still walk by, that are very much a part of Eve's everyday life and all of my characters' everyday life, that are parts of everyday New Yorkers now. And I really just, especially in this modern climate, where people are feeling that there's a lot of polarization. There's something really great about New York, about that fact that people have come together for centuries across all different walks of life, across from everywhere in the world, and they have existed in, you know, small spaces, and they've tried to make a city work. And there's something really, I think, hopeful about all of that. And that's been something that's been a part of New York's identity for a very, very long time. And it's something that is, I think, very invigorating about the city. So I know a lot of broad facts about New York. And so my research really came into like sort of hunting and pecking the things that I had to double check. Okay, well, where would be the nearest, like just the logistical things that may not still be standing, in terms of, oh, if they're taking a trolley car, if they're taking an elevated rail, there was an elevated rail along Lexington and 3rd that is no longer extant, but it was very much, if you're in that area, you couldn't mistake hearing it. And if you were trying to get up and down the east side, you absolutely would utilize it. So there were certain transit things that I wanted to make sure that I had correct, or at least approximate. But they do a lot of walking because it's New York. And I like the idea of, I try to make them walk around the city so that you as the reader can really feel like you are walking the city. I mean, I think that's, as a walking tour guide, I kind of wanted to give you a bit of that experience and sort of say, all right, well, I'm going to guide you through the city streets here a bit. And that's been one of the things that people have responded to really well, that they can feel the atmosphere of the city, because a lot of that is still there. So I just sort of pick up on the bones of what's already still there, and then just try to fill in all the rest of the details, the rest of the shifts and the changes. It's always been a noisy city. It's just that rather than car horns, there would have been, you know, the clop of horse hooves. So it's, you know, it's just the sensory details are slightly different, but the pace is still the same.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's fascinating for me, and I do feel like I'm getting a feel for the city as I'm reading, but it's still very unfamiliar to me. I'm sure that, you know, but it feels like if I knew it better, I'd be able to see it. I could recognize it. I feel like.
I think that New York is a place that's got a lot of mythology about it anyway. And so, you know, everyone has an idea of New York and what it is, even if they haven't been here, because it is in so much media. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with folks bringing a sort of modern myth making to this city. That's totally fine. I'm just kind of touching down in little places and hopefully not getting too bogged down in all of the details. My editor reins me back when I've gone on to like a rant about architecture, because I really love architecture. But not all of that is, when you're trying to stick to a plot and pacing, you can't put every last detail in about that. But I really could go on rants about architecture.
Awesome. So I feel like we've talked a bit about kind of New York and the history as a bit of an inspiration. But the sort of last question, because I don't want to keep you for too long, is about your Gothic inspiration. So obviously Poe, but how did you get into the Gothic? What are your Gothic inspirations? What's your Goth life, I guess?
I was about 7 or 8 years old, and a very clever teacher knew I had this dark side, even as, you know, a sort of a bouncy kid. Just kind of had a read on me pretty early on that I really loved a good ghost story. You know, I was infamous for terrifying my Girl Scout troop with made up ghost stories on the spot. And it just been something I was always fascinated with. Just like the dark side of things, but like the fun dark side of things, like the Nightmare Before Christmas, Halloween Town kind of fun. I was never into the true horror. Only like, how can we have fun with horror elements, but come back to a place of safety? So sort of the thrill of the ride without going into complete, you know, a point of no return, as it were. So, and I think that's why I kind of loved Poe so early. So this teacher who sort of shared Poe with me at a very early age, you know, knew that was a great entry point for me, because Poe's stories are very accessible. They're short, even though he's working with a rich Victorian text. It's not so bogged down. It's a lot easier to get into than like Henry James. I mean, bless Henry James, but really it's like, oh, okay, you got to kind of slog a bit. So there's an efficiency to Poe's language that makes him a lot more accessible when you're a younger reader. And that really started me off, both his stories and his poetry, because there was something, he was turning difficult, scary, sad things into beautiful things too. And sort of that juxtaposition is really what drove me. And then of course I just kind of followed the trails of the other classics. I loved Dracula. I loved Frankenstein. I am a huge Jane Eyre fan. I read Wuthering Heights, but there's, you know, you get this sort of, there's the Wuthering Heights camp and then there's the Jane Eyre camp, you know. And I mean, Wuthering Heights was like, oh God, this is so miserable, but it's beautiful, but it's like meant to be miserable. Like the people that think that that's romantic, I'm like, wait, no, this is not, no, this is a lesson on how not to be. Jane Eyre, I was like, oh, okay, all right. I admit, like, I liked the romance angle about it. Mad Woman in the Attic withstanding, I guess. Interestingly enough, you know, the idea that like nothing is perfect was always something that was really interesting to me. So I kind of just went along with a lot of the classics of the era, but then of course was just as captivated by fantasy fiction as well. So I really was kind of reading, you know, Lord of the Rings and then Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler and Anne McCaffrey and, you know, fantasists, along with, and Madeleine L'Engle, of course. She's a huge influence on me. Side by side in with these sort of Victorian texts. So that's probably where some of the fusion of the Gothic and the fantastical comes into my worldview. And just ever since I can remember, I've just been fascinated by the divine mystery of the veil and the thin line between the living and the dead. And so all of my books just continue to ask these questions about the fantastical and about the paranormal. I've had very strange experiences that I can't explain. So I am also a believer in the paranormal, though I definitely go to a logical explanation first. And then when that fails, then okay, well then that's a fantastical thing. And I don't sort of really sweat the details. I kind of enjoy the idea, well, we're never really going to know, are we? I don't know if we'll know. If we know, we'll know. And in the meantime, I get to ask questions and write about them and sort of turn the facet of these other keys to human curiosity and existence. And I think just the idea of ghosts are so popular because they're a paranormal creature that is of us. They are our loved ones, or we could be them, and they can be us. They can also be sort of guardian angels, or they can be startling terrors. There's such a range of possibility with ghosts. And so that's just been the main trope that I continue to go back to is trying to tell different ghost stories and ways in which energy, the energy of life, can be used and manipulated across many different kinds of circumstances, or turned into weaponry, those kinds of things. I think I'm just fascinated by the possibilities that that exist within the Gothic, because there's just so much rich viscera, I think, within the Gothic, that for me, I just keep coming back to it as the most compelling way to tell stories, because I'm a very character-driven novelist, and the Gothic is really about psychology as an engine. And so really getting a chance to sort of see what makes these characters and the world around them tick is really kind of one of my favorite ongoing missions and quests every series, to try to figure out these moving pieces, and how are they going to get through their various haunted spaces.
Amazing. I think it's fascinating. I'm really interested that I was a bit the same with mixing the Gothic and the fantasy growing up. So I do love crossover stuff that has both in.
And it's hard. It's so hard baked into my youth that I don't really know how to, I can't separate them out. For me, it's all very, very entwined. So all of my interests really just merged into this cross-genre soup when I was young. And I started my first novel when I was 11 years old. It was a sequel to The Phantom of the Opera. So we all have one of those sort of, fan fiction things that, but I was going like full Gaston Leroux with this, which I love Leroux's novel. And I was fascinated by his writing. And so that whole era, so I've always been in the 1880s, 1890s, ever since I was 11, I've been writing in this era. And people are like, what is with this era? And I think it's a past life, because my draw to that particular era is so strong and so intense. And there's things I tap into that I don't really feel like are necessarily my own, but they feel very authentic and they feel like I've channeled something. And so, people are like, what's your process like? And I'm like, well, I'm kind of like the mediums that I write about, because I am sort of channeling an era that I feel is complicated and fraught. It wasn't a great era, especially if you were anyone other than a rich white guy. So it's it's not that I'm romanticizing the era at all. I just feel like there's a lot to say about it. And also because we are living in lots of repeat territory now. There's a lot that I write about, the themes of people striving for justice and equality, as my characters are from all their various identities and backgrounds. There's a lot of that stuff that's still maddeningly still in play. And so in some ways I can talk a lot about what we're going through right now because I'm talking about 100 years ago. So
I mean, that is a classic Gothic move, casting contemporary anxieties back into the past.
it is in order to talk about them, because people don't want to see them in this current climate. But it's sort of like, well, we have been here before, and I do think it's useful that way. And also, I think that a lot of folks think that issues like feminism are a modern thing, and they're really not. And I just really like to, serve as a reminder, even though I'm not writing historical nonfiction, I'm writing fiction. But my spiritualists, I have these female leaders, and women were leaders in the spiritualist movement. It's how women got to have certain places of prominence as public speakers in the late Victorian era. It's how Victoria Woodhull was able to run for president in 1872 with Frederick Douglass, a Black man, as her running mate. Because she came up from spiritualist circles. That was a place where women were allowed to speak in public, which hadn't really been allowed before spiritualism kind of opened a door and let women be experts in certain things. So whether or not you believe that Victoria Woodhull really could speak to spirits, I think she was using a lot of things just to her advantage. That's sort of immaterial. It opened a door, and folks were trying to find ways to sort of propose a new agenda, a new way of looking at things. And so spiritualism being directly tied to the women's rights movement is one of the major themes through my books. 40 some years before women would get the vote, but the engine for the things that are just a part of our modern world was happening at that point. And so I like talking about those things and reminding folks that, like, hey, we've got folks who have been saying things about justice and equality for a long time, and let's keep saying them.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'm very passionate about kind of not erasing that history by thinking we've got new things going on now, and we rarely ever do.
Mm-hmm. Right, the terminology changes, but a lot of, and the Gothic when the Gothic focuses on the psychological fears of the age, it tells you so much about the era. And I think that a lot of those things are still in play. And so the idea that I can focus on the preoccupations of the era as another way to talk about our preoccupations is just, it's inescapable. And I think it's, you don't want to escape from that as a writer. We have to take things in their historic context, both from the historic texts that we were very shaped and informed by. But then we are also not writing from that time period. We are writing now, informed by these other things. But how can we make sure that we're not just doing a retread and carrying on old injustices? How can we continue to be reinventing these things, even though so many things have not changed? How can we, though, turn a notch towards something that is change? And otherwise we'll just be in an endless cycle. And I don't really want us to be in an endless loop. I would like for things to be continuing to move forward, even though I am writing about the past. But in some ways it's like, that's how I'm able to get my head around how can we move into the future.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. It's great. I love that sort of kind of conception of historical writing, because I think one of my pet bugbears is when people say, oh, it's just, that's how it was back in the day. Like, oh yeah, but also you don't need to be like that.
Well, truly, it's like people that excuse racism as being like, oh, well, it just was that way back then. Well, people also knew it was wrong back then. That's why the abolitionists, put their lives on the line across all the, people have known for a long time that systems of oppression are not fun and not great, and they harm people. So, that's not us being like, oh, we're so much more wise to that now, or so, looking back and being like, oh, those silly Victorians. We need to grapple with that now too. But it doesn't mean that the perspective, that there weren't people then that said, hey, let's examine this, and let's try to break this down. Whether or not they had, the ability at that point to change laws, that continues to be in flux. And that's, we still have to be fighting for our rights. One of the things that I talk a lot about on my tours is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and workers' safety and workers' rights are constantly having to be fought for. And that is a battle we are not at all free from. We are not at all past that. The idea of profits over human bodies. And so it was the worst industrial fire that happened in 1911, and it just was a horrific incident. And so I sort of use the triangle a bit in my Spectral City series, because I have two ghosts who died in a garment district fire. My book takes place 12 years before that fire, the famous fire, would have happened. However, one of the reasons why there was such outcry from the years around the Triangle fire is because there had been so many garment district fires already, and there had already been a riot about it, and there had already had been the uprising of the 20,000. And so that makes the tragedy of the Triangle that much worse, because the dialogue had been opened about workers' rights. So I think that, there's so many things that we still need to make sure that we're keeping track of across every board in terms of what kind of society we want to be living in. And that's, I'm trying to write on the side of hope, and write on the side of togetherness, and, my group of plucky folks coming together from all backgrounds to save the day. But at the same time, still mentioning how much work there is to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for chatting to me. I
Oh
will
my gosh, anytime.
stop the recording, but thank you very much.